Under the family adultery law, any spouse who commits adultery will be subject to 2 to 10 years in prison if their faithful spouse decides to press charges. At the same time, that boyfriend or girlfriend outside the marriage, if that boyfriend or girlfriend knew that they were having sexual relations with someone who was already married to someone else, then that boyfriend or girlfriend will also be subject to 2 to 10 years in prison if the faithful spouse of the marriage decides to press charges. However, the family adultery law, it's not about punishing people who commit adultery. It's about preventing them from ever committing the victimization of adultery at all in the first place. Hello everyone, my name is Marvin. I'm the creator of the family adultery law. If you don't know what that is, here's the thumbnail for it. Look this video up and watch it. It's about 14 and a half minutes long. Family is spelled F-A-M-L-I, FAM-LI. This video explains the 5 foundations of the family adultery law and how they work. If you haven't seen this video yet, I strongly recommend you watch it. I want to talk some today about how the 5 foundations work together with each other in order to prevent the victimization of adultery. So it's not about punishing people, it's about preventing the victimization of adultery from ever happening at all in the first place. The first foundation of the family adultery law states very clearly that if someone's married and they commit adultery, then the faithful spouse of the marriage will have the option to press charges or not. If they press charges and that adultery adultery victimizer spouse is found guilty, then they will go to jail for 2 to 10 years. At the same time, that boyfriend or girlfriend that they were having sexual relations with, if that boyfriend or girlfriend knew that they were having sexual relations with someone who was already married to someone else, then that boyfriend or girlfriend is also going to be subject to 2 to 10 years in prison if the faithful spouse decides to press charges. And there are other foundations to the family adultery law. However, those two will go a long way in preventing anyone from ever committing adultery victimization against their family at all in the first place. And here's why. First off, the family adultery law, it's an individual choice law. It's a law that each engaged couple will choose whether or not they want to have the family adultery law for their personal private marriage that they're about to begin with each other. If you're wondering how does that work, watch the video. It explains that in the video. But basically, every engaged couple will choose whether or not they want the family adultery law for their personal private marriage that they're about to begin with each other. They make that choice themselves and nobody makes it for them. So they don't have to have the family adultery law. So that fiance who then becomes the adultery victimizer, that fiance didn't have to have the family adultery law. They could have chosen to not have it, but they didn't. They chose to marry their fiance who is the kind of a person who did want to have the family adultery law for their personal private marriage. So that fiance who became the adultery victimizer, they chose to marry a person who wanted the family adultery. They knew that before they married that person. They married him anyway. Then after they married that person who wants the family adultery law, that a spouse who's the adultery victimizer, they then chose at some point during the marriage to commit the victimization of adultery. So the adultery victimizer really has no argument of any kind as to getting off the hook or not being prosecuted if the evidence is there that adultery victimization was committed, and if the faithful spouse of the marriage decides they're going to press charges, then it doesn't matter what kind of reasons they might give as to why did they commit adultery or things like that. They're going to go to jail for 2 to 10 years, period. So that serves as a very strong motivation to that adultery victimizer to never commit adultery at all in the first place. So they never become an adultery victimizer. The way the family adultery law works, it doesn't kick in when somebody commits adultery. It kicks in the day they get married. That's when the family adultery law starts with your personal private marriage if you choose to have it. If you choose not to have it, then your personal private marriage is completely as if the family adultery law never existed. But if that engaged couple chooses to have it, then it starts the day they get married. As their marriage continues and one of those two spouses starts to feel the temptation to commit adultery for any reason, they're going to know that they chose to have the family adultery law for their marriage. What are the chances they're going to commit adultery when they know they made the choice to have the family adultery law and that they chose to keep their own family adultery law rights just the same as their fiance, who's now their wife or their husband, just the same as their spouse chose to have their family adultery law rights? So the vast majority of wives who would commit adultery against their husbands, or husbands who would commit adultery against their wives, they're not going to do it in the first place. There's a small minority who would still choose to commit adultery, but the vast majority is not. On top of that, every single one of these spouses who's feeling the temptation to commit adultery, they haven't committed adultery yet, but they're not happy with their marriage, there's problems of one type or another, they're feeling the temptation. Well, under the family adultery law, they've got 5 legal choices for dealing with whatever their marital problems are. Okay, 5 choices that are completely legal under the family adultery law. The one choice of adultery, that's the illegal choice, okay? But you've got 5 other choices. These 5 other choices, the first one is marriage counseling. Divorce is one of the 5, okay? So they're not trapped in a loveless marriage or something like that. They're not trapped in anything. These 5 legal choices make it very clear that they've got very effective ways of dealing with their marital problems, no matter what they may be, and that they're not trapped in a marriage. The one choice of adultery is the only choice that's illegal. You're wondering, how does that work? With the 5 foundations of the family adultery law, watch the video. So the vast majority of spouses who are tempted will never commit adultery. But that small minority who would decide to commit adultery anyway, after all that, who are they going to commit adultery with? Because under the family adultery law, any boyfriend or girlfriend who, potential boyfriend or girlfriend, who knows that that spouse is already married to someone else, they're going to be subject to the same punishment if the faithful wife decides to press charges or the faithful husband decides to press charges. That boyfriend or girlfriend outside the marriage, they're going to be subject to the same 2 to 10 years in prison. So if that adultery, that spouse who's tempted to commit adultery, the only people they can commit adultery with is someone who does not know that they're already married. So that gets rid of the vast majority of co-workers and associates and friends of the family and so forth. Anyone out there who might, that they associate with at all, is going to know that they're already married to someone else. So about the only people they could ever commit adultery with is a complete stranger, which makes it difficult to commit adultery. And so even that small minority of people who would be tempted and would still want to commit adultery, because they're not going to be able to commit adultery with a coworker, or the coworker will say, no, I don't want to go to jail for 2 to 10 years just to have sexual relations with someone who's already married to someone else, especially with already kids in that marriage and everything. No, I don't want to risk it. So they won't even have adultery with that person who's already married, or maybe a next door neighbor, an acquaintance, a family friend, whatever. They're all going to say no, because they don't want to risk going to jail, just the same as that tempted spouse does not want to risk going to jail. So again, the adultery just doesn't happen, and that spouse who's tempted is, again, pointed back to the 5 legal choices for dealing with their marital problems instead of the one illegal choice of adultery. And if they do one of these 5 legal choices without ever committing adultery at all in the first place, then the ability of these 5 legal choices to either fix the marriage and make it a happy marriage that it was the day they got married, which is when the family adultery law began with that marriage, the day they got married. The ability of these 5 legal choices to fix the marriage and get it to a happy marriage again becomes much greater if they're choosing one of these 5 legal choices without ever committing adultery at all in the first place. One of these choices is divorce. So if they just want to get divorced, they just have had it, they haven't committed adultery, nobody has. They want to get divorced any way they can, just the same. The family adultery law does not affect the divorce laws at all. But even then, if they get divorced, at least they'll be getting divorced without one of them having committed adultery against the other, which again means that there's a better possibility that the divorce relationship between those two will be less contentious, not so bitter and angry, as you see with some of these other divorced couples where one committed adultery, and as a result, the level of bitterness and anger and fury remains for many years after the marriage ends, which affects the children of the divorce, of course, and all that. So even if someone gets divorced without ever committing adultery at all in the first place, the family adultery law still helps, at least some, by making sure that at least they got divorced without ever committing adultery at all in the first place. So the family adultery law, it's not about punishment. It's about the prevention of a very serious form of victimization of families. People don't realize how serious the victimization of adultery is to the entire family. Unless you've actually been a faithful husband dealing with an unfaithful wife, or a faithful wife dealing with an unfaithful husband, and especially if you had young children to be raised. When you found out your spouse was being unfaithful, then you're going to understand it. But even those people who are themselves adultery victims, most of them will probably say that before they ever became an adultery victim, their attitude towards adultery was completely different than what it was the day they became an adultery victim. The family adultery law is a very radical law. At least some people might consider it a radical law. But when you've got some sort of a problem, and it's a serious problem in society that victimizes people in very severe ways, victimizes families, victimizes the children of families in a very severe way, that problem doesn't seem to go away. Perhaps it even gets worse. After a certain number of decades, maybe even centuries of time, it's time to consider some sort of a radical idea as not being radical, as being perhaps the level-headed, just, and fair way of dealing with the problem. This is what the family adultery law is. You might think, gosh, 2 to 10 years in prison, that sounds like a lot. And then the boyfriend or girlfriend outside the marriage, if they knew they were having sexual relations with someone already married to someone else, they'll go to jail for 2 to 10 years also? Gosh, that sounds radical. Watch this video and you'll see, no, it's not so radical, because the family adultery law is an individual choice law. It guarantees that the individual will choose how will the issue of adultery be treated in their personal private marriage, separate from everyone else's personal private marriage, starting the day they choose to marry that fiancé who is now their faithful wife or their faithful husband, starting the day they choose to marry that fiancé who is now their unfaithful wife or their unfaithful husband. It's between the two of them, starting the day they get married, as the marriage continues year after year. And if the marriage ends for whatever reason, they will choose their state government, their family court systems, of whichever family court system they have or state government they live in, will have no choice over the family adultery law, because the family adultery law is going to be a federal law that will supersede all state laws. Okay, again, gosh, that sounds radical. No, it's not. Watch the video. Okay. Watch this video, you'll see that it's not a radical idea. It's actually a very level-headed, just and fair way for people to be able to deal with the issue of adultery within their own personal private marriage, separate from the way other people would deal with the issue of adultery in their separate personal private marriages. Okay, this is how the family adultery law works, and the government chooses for nobody. Period. The government chooses for nobody. And if you think about it, that's the way marriage ought to be. The two people decide, and nobody else decides for them, especially the government. So watch this video. At the end of this family adultery law video, 14 and a half minutes long, at the end, towards the end, there's two questions that are posed to the viewer. Listen to those two questions, consider them, think about them, and leave comments. Let me know what you think about the family adultery law, that yes, you think it's a good idea and it should become federal law as soon as possible, or no, you think it's a bad idea. Tell me why. Okay, I'll talk to you again.